Sometimes the most unlikely friendships teach us what family really means. When rancher Jack Ryland found an orphaned mountain lion cub 6 years ago, he never imagined it would change his life forever. The cub, Scout, grew up alongside Duke, Jack's German shepherd. Now fully grown, Scout doesn't hunt like a wild mountain lion should. Instead, he fetches sticks, wrestles with Duke, and guards the ranch like any loyal dog, but their peaceful life is about to be shattered. An out-of-town developer wants Jack's land and threatens to expose Scout's unconventional upbringing. The town must decide, is Scout a dangerous wild animal or proof that love and family go beyond species? What happens when this extraordinary bond truly faces its ultimate test? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana morning arrived as it always did on the Ryland Ranch. Quiet as a prayer, with mist rolling off the distant peaks like smoke from a dying campfire. Jack Ryland stood on his front porch, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching the sun paint the grasslands gold. At 57, he'd seen over 20,000 sunrises from this very spot, but each one still felt like a small miracle. A wet nose pressed against his elbow, and Jack looked down to see Duke, his German shepherd, tail wagging with the patient enthusiasm of a dog who knew his routine by heart. "Morning, old friend," Jack murmured, scratching behind Duke's ears. The dog had been his companion for 8 years now, ever since Jack found him as a stray puppy near the highway. Half-starved and completely trusting, movement in the pasture caught his eye, and Jack smiled as he watched Scout emerge from the tall grass. At 6 years old, the mountain lion moved with the fluid grace of his wild heritage, but there was something unmistakably domestic in the way he bounded toward the house. Scout's tawny coat caught the morning light as he approached, muscles rippling beneath his fur. He was magnificent, nearly 7 feet from nose to tail, weighing close to 160 pounds of pure predator. Yet when he reached the porch, Scout sat just like Duke did, looking up at Jack with amber eyes full of affection and trust. "There's my boys," Jack said, setting down his coffee to give Scout the same gentle attention he'd given Duke. The big cat purred, a sound deep and rumbling that never failed to amaze Jack. Mountain lions didn't typically purr like house cats, but Scout had learned it from watching Duke's contentment under Jack's touch. The leather dog collar around Scout's neck was worn smooth from years of wear, the metal tag reading simply Scout Ryland. Jack had made that collar himself when Scout was just a few months old, fashioning it from cowhide in his workshop on a winter evening when the cub had outgrown his first one. It had seemed natural then, giving Scout the same identification any ranch dog would wear. Now 6 years later, the collar represented something deeper, a declaration that this wild creature belonged here, belonged to this family that defied every conventional definition. Inside the house, Jack prepared breakfast for his unusual family. Duke got his kibble mixed with leftover beef from last night's dinner. Scout received raw meat, deer when Jack could hunt it, beef when he couldn't. The rancher had learned early on that Scout's digestive system wasn't built for processed dog food, despite the mountain lion's other domestic preferences. As they ate, Jack pulled out his father's old ranch journal, a leather-bound book so worn the edges were soft as velvet. Samuel Ryland had started the journal in 1952 when he first claimed this land, documenting everything from cattle births to weather patterns, from equipment repairs to personal reflections on the solitary life of ranching. Jack continued the tradition, adding his own observations to pages yellowed with age and wisdom. October 15th, he wrote in his careful script. "Scout helped with the cattle again today. Seems to understand the work better than some hired hands I've known. Duke keeps close to him during herding. They work like they've done it all their lives together." It was true. Scout had developed an instinct for ranch work that amazed everyone who witnessed it. The mountain lion would position himself on the opposite side of stray cattle, gently encouraging them back toward the herd, with his presence alone. He never showed aggression, never used his natural predatory instincts inappropriately. Instead, Scout seemed to understand that these animals were under his protection, part of his extended family. Jack remembered the day he'd first discovered Scout's herding ability. The mountain lion was barely 2 years old, and a few steers had wandered too far from the main group. Duke was working to bring them back, but the cattle were being stubborn. Without any prompting, Scout had simply walked to the far side of the strays and sat down. His presence, calm but commanding, was enough to convince the cattle to move back toward Duke and the herd. It was as if Scout instinctively understood the job needed doing and wanted to help. The rancher's thoughts drifted back to that night 6 years ago when everything changed. He'd been checking fence lines after a storm, Duke riding in the truck bed, when they heard the sounds, a desperate mewing that cut through the wind like a cry for help. Following the sound, Jack had found the cub tangled in barbed wire, no bigger than a house cat, but fighting with the fierce determination of his wild heritage. His mother was nowhere to be found, likely dead from the storm or hunter's bullet. Jack had stood there in the rain, holding the tiny, injured cub, knowing he faced an impossible choice. The logical thing would be to call wildlife authorities, but the nearest ranger station was 3 hours away, and the cub needed immediate medical attention. The practical thing would be to put the animal out of its misery. A wild predator could never survive domestication. Everyone knew that. But when the cub stopped struggling and looked up at Jack with those enormous amber eyes, something in the rancher's heart made the decision for him. He'd been alone on the ranch for too many years, since his wife Sarah died, with only Duke for company. The isolation had started to feel like a weight on his chest, and maybe, just maybe, this frightened little creature needed him as much as he needed something to care for. The first few weeks were the hardest. Jack had to bottle feed Scout every few hours, like caring for a human infant. He researched mountain lion nutrition, consulted with veterinarians who thought he was crazy, and slowly learned to read Scout's needs and moods. Duke remarkably had adopted the cub immediately, cleaning him, sharing warmth, and teaching him through patient example. As Scout grew, the challenges multiplied. The cub's natural instincts would surface unexpectedly. He'd pounce on Duke during play, forgetting his increasing size and strength. He'd bring Jack presents of dead rabbits and squirrels, the same way a house cat might leave mice on the doorstep. He'd climb to impossible heights on shelves and rafters, using claws that could shred furniture without effort. But for every challenge, there was a reward. Scout's intelligence was remarkable, almost human-like in its complexity. He learned to open doors by watching Jack, figured out how to turn on faucets when he wanted fresh water, and developed a vocabulary of sounds that clearly communicated different needs and emotions. When Jack was sick with flu 2 winters ago, Scout had barely left his side. Lying across the foot of the bed like an enormous, purring heating pad, Martha Henderson, who lived on the neighboring ranch, had been skeptical at first. A widow herself, she'd been bringing Jack supplies and companionship for years, but Scout's arrival had worried her considerably. "Jack, that thing's going to kill you in your sleep one day," she'd said bluntly during Scout's first year. But even Martha had come around when she saw how gentle the mountain lion was, how he'd approach her slowly and politely, as if asking permission before accepting her scratches behind the ears. "That cat's got better manners than most people," Martha admitted eventually. She'd started bringing extra meat when she visited, always claiming it was about to go bad anyway, rather than acknowledging that she was contributing to Scout's care. The ranch itself had become Scout's kingdom, and he patrolled its boundaries with the dedication of a devoted guardian. Coyotes learned to avoid the property entirely after encountering Scout on his rounds. Bears gave the ranch a wide berth, sensing the presence of another apex predator. But Scout never hunted for sport or aggression. He was protecting his family and territory, just as any ranch dog might do. Jack's neighbors had gradually accepted Scout's presence, understanding that the mountain lion posed no threat to their livestock or families. Children from surrounding ranches had grown up seeing Scout as just another ranch animal, no more dangerous than a large dog. The local veterinarian, Dr. Patricia Morse, had agreed to provide Scout's medical care after seeing the remarkable bond between the animal and his human family. Now finishing his coffee on the porch, Jack watched Scout and Duke play their morning game of tug-of-war with an old rope toy. The mountain lion's size advantage was negated by his gentleness. He never pulled too hard, never used his full strength. Duke, despite being outweighed by 60 pounds, held his own through sheer determination and the confidence that came from years of brotherhood. The peaceful rhythm of their life felt eternal, as natural as the seasons changing over the Montana landscape. Jack had no way of knowing that this morning would be one of the last times he'd watch his unusual family play together without a cloud of worry hanging over them. Change was coming to the ranch, arriving in the form of a sleek black sedan that would soon disturb the dust on their private road. But for now, in the golden morning light, Jack Ryland was simply a man blessed with the love of two remarkable animals who had chosen to call him family. Scout's purr rumbled across the porch as the mountain lion settled next to Duke, both of them watching their human with the patient devotion that had defined their days together for 6 wonderful years. The black sedan looked out of place on the dirt road leading to Jack's ranch, like a funeral car lost in paradise. Jack noticed it first as a distant glint of sun on metal, then watched with growing unease as the vehicle approached his property. Visitors were rare enough that Duke and Scout both lifted their heads from their afternoon nap on the porch. Sensing their human sudden tension, the car stopped near the house, and a man in an expensive suit climbed out, his polished shoes immediately collecting dust from the Montana soil. He was younger than Jack, by at least 15 years, with perfectly styled dark hair and the kind of confident smile that never quite reached the eyes. He carried a leather briefcase and surveyed the ranch with the calculating gaze of someone appraising property value. Mr. Jack Ryland. The man's voice carried an urban accent, sharp and precise. I'm Vincent Carrera with Mountain Vista Development Corporation. Jack stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving to Duke's head while keeping Scout in his peripheral vision. The mountain lion had grown still, amber eyes locked on the stranger with an intensity that made Jack's stomach tighten. This is private property, Jack said simply. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying. Carrera's smile widened, but it held no warmth. Actually, Mr. Ryland, I'm here about purchasing. Specifically, your land. He opened his briefcase and pulled out several official-looking documents. My company is developing a luxury mountain resort in this area, and your property is perfectly positioned for our needs. Not interested. Jack's response was immediate and final. I understand your attachment to this place, Carrera continued smoothly, stepping closer despite Duke's low growl. Family land, sentimental value, I get it, but I'm prepared to offer you significantly above market value. Enough money to buy a nice place in town, closer to medical facilities and conveniences. A man your age might appreciate. I said, I'm not interested. Jack's voice carried the kind of authority that had been dealing with difficult cattle and stubborn weather for decades. Carrera's expression shifted slightly, the fake friendliness slipping just enough to reveal something colder underneath. Mr. Ryland, I think you misunderstand the situation. This isn't really a negotiation. He pulled out a thick legal document, its pages crisp and official. The letterhead read, Legal Notice of Eminent Domain Proceedings, in bold type, with seals and signatures that gave it the weight of governmental authority. The state has approved our resort project as beneficial for local economic development, Carrera explained, his tone now matter-of-fact. Under eminent domain laws, we have the right to acquire your property for fair compensation, whether you agree to sell or not. Jack's blood chilled as he scanned the document. The legal language was dense and intimidating, full of terms like public benefit and economic necessity, but the meaning was clear. His ranch, his home, his life, everything he'd built here could be taken away by legal force. This can't be right, Jack said, his voice rougher than he intended. This land has been in my family for over 70 years. I'm sorry, but property history doesn't override legal proceedings, Carrera replied with manufactured sympathy. However, if you cooperate voluntarily, the compensation will be much more generous. Fight it in court, and you'll only delay the inevitable while accumulating legal fees you can't afford. Scout had risen to his feet during the conversation, his massive form moving with deceptive casualness as he positioned himself between Jack and the stranger. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. The mountain lion was protecting his family. Carrera noticed Scout for the first time, and his professional composure cracked. "Jesus Christ, is that a mountain lion?" "That's Scout," Jack said quietly, his hand moving to the big cat's neck in a gesture both protective and reassuring. "He's part of the family. You can't keep a wild animal as a pet." Carrera stepped backward, his voice rising with genuine alarm. "That's illegal in every state." "Scout's not a pet," Jack replied calmly, though his heart was pounding. "He's a rescued animal who chose to stay here." Carrera fumbled for his phone, his earlier professional demeanor completely gone. "This is a massive safety violation. Wildlife authorities, animal control, the sheriff, they all need to know about this immediately." Duke positioned himself next to Scout, both animals forming a protective barrier in front of Jack. Neither showed aggression, but their message was clear. The stranger was not welcome here. "You have 30 days to respond to the legal notice," Carrera said, backing toward his car while keeping his eyes on Scout. "But this animal situation changes everything. When I report what I've seen here, you'll be lucky if you have 30 hours before they come to remove that thing." "Scout isn't hurting anyone," Jack said, desperation creeping into his voice. "He's been here 6 years without a single incident. It's a 150-pound predator with fangs and claws." Carrera shouted from beside his open car door. "Do you have any idea what liability that creates? What happens when it finally snaps and kills someone?" "He won't," Jack started, but Carrera was already climbing into his sedan. 30 days for the land, Mr. Ryland. But that cat will be gone much sooner. I guarantee it." The black car sped away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly over the ranch like a shroud. Jack stood frozen on his porch, the legal documents trembling in his hands, while Duke and Scout pressed close against his legs in silent support. The paper in his hands felt heavier than lead. Every line of legal text was a threat to everything he held dear. The ranch wasn't just his home. It was his sanctuary, the place where he'd built an impossible family and found peace after years of loneliness. Without this land, Scout couldn't survive. Wildlife authorities would either cage him or put him down, never understanding that this remarkable animal had chosen love over wildness. Jack sank into his porch chair, the weight of his situation crushing down on him. Scout immediately laid his massive head on Jack's knee, purring softly in an attempt to comfort his human. Duke settled on the other side, his warm presence steady and reassuring. "What are we going to do?" Jack whispered to his animals, scratching Scout behind the ears while Duke pressed closer. The mountain lion's amber eyes met his, full of trust and affection, completely unaware that their peaceful life together was now under attack from forces beyond their control. The legal notice outlined a timeline that felt like a countdown to execution. 30 days to lose his home, perhaps only hours before authorities arrived to take Scout away. The developer's threat hung in the air like storm clouds, and Jack knew that Vincent Carrera was exactly the type of man who would follow through on his promises. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Jack held his family close and tried to figure out how to fight a battle he wasn't sure he could win. The ranch had never felt more beautiful or more fragile than it did in that moment, when everything he loved was suddenly at risk of being torn away forever. Jack barely slept that night. The legal documents spread across his kitchen table like a diagnosis of terminal illness. Scout seemed to sense his distress, refusing to leave his side even for his usual evening patrol of the ranch boundaries. The mountain lion lay pressed against Jack's chair while he read and reread the eminent domain notice, searching for loopholes that didn't exist. By dawn, Jack had made his first decision. He needed legal help, and he needed it fast. The drive to Billings took 2 hours, with Duke riding shotgun and Scout stretched across the back seat of Jack's old pickup truck. Other drivers stared openly when they spotted the mountain lion, but Jack was beyond caring about appearances. Scout was family, and family stuck together, especially when facing a crisis. The law office of Margaret Stone occupied the ground floor of a modest building downtown, its simple sign promising honest legal representation for working people. Jack had found her name in the phone book, drawn to her advertisement's mention of property rights and rural law. Margaret Stone was a woman in her mid-40s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen enough human tragedy to remain compassionate but realistic. She listened without interruption as Jack explained his situation, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. "Mr. Rylan," she said finally, setting down her reading glasses, "I won't lie to you. Eminent domain cases are incredibly difficult to fight, especially when the government declares a project to be in the public interest. But this is just some rich developer wanting to build a resort," Jack protested. "How is that public interest? If the project creates jobs and generates tax revenue, courts often consider that sufficient public benefit," Margaret explained gently. "The bar for eminent domain approval has gotten lower over the years, not higher." Jack felt his chest tighten. "So there's nothing I can do?" "I didn't say that." Margaret leaned forward, her tone becoming more focused. "There are potential challenges we can raise. Environmental impact, insufficient compensation, procedural errors in the filing. But I need to be honest about something else. Your mountain lion situation complicates everything." Jack's hands clenched in his lap. "Scout isn't the problem here. In the eyes of the law, he absolutely is," Margaret said firmly. "Keeping a wild predator without proper permits is a serious violation. If this developer reports you, wildlife authorities will be forced to act immediately. That could give them additional justification for seizing your property under safety concerns. Scout has never hurt anyone," Jack said, his voice strained. "He's been on my ranch for 6 years without a single incident." "I believe you," Margaret replied. "But the law doesn't distinguish between well-behaved wild animals and dangerous ones. The liability issues alone would terrify any insurance company or government agency." She pulled out a yellow legal pad and began taking notes. "Here's what we need to do immediately. First, I'll file a preliminary injunction to delay any seizure proceedings. That might buy us 60 to 90 days. Second, we need to document everything about Scout's history and behavior. Veterinary records, witness statements, anything that shows he's not a threat." Jack felt a spark of hope. "Dr. Morse has been treating him for years. Martha Henderson, my neighbor, knows Scout well. There are others who could testify." "Good, but it may not be enough," Margaret warned. "The bigger issue is finding an alternative solution for Scout. Wildlife authorities won't allow him to stay on your property, especially if ownership is in dispute. We need to find a licensed facility that can take him." "You mean like a zoo?" Jack's voice went hollow. "Or a wildlife sanctuary, if we can find one with space and proper permits." Margaret's expression softened at Jack's obvious distress. "I know this isn't what you want to hear, but we have to be realistic about options." Jack stood abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see his truck in the parking lot. Scout was visible through the rear window, patiently waiting for his human to return. The sight of the mountain lion's trusting face made Jack's throat constrict with emotion. "He won't understand," Jack said quietly. "Scout thinks this is his home, that Duke and I are his family. How do I explain to him that the law says he doesn't belong with us?" "Sometimes the law isn't fair," Margaret acknowledged. "But if we don't act quickly, you could lose both the ranch and Scout. At least if we find him a good sanctuary, he'll be alive and cared for." Jack turned back to the lawyer, his jaw set with determination. "How long do we have before they come for him?" "If Carrera files his report today, wildlife authorities could show up as early as tomorrow with a seizure order. We need to move fast." Margaret spent the next hour outlining their legal strategy. She would immediately file for an emergency restraining order to prevent any seizure of the property or animals pending a full hearing. She would also begin researching wildlife sanctuaries within driving distance that might accept Scout on short notice. "The legal fees will be substantial," she warned as Jack prepared to leave. "Fighting eminent domain requires expert witnesses, environmental impact studies, appeals processes. We're looking at potentially $50,000 or more." Jack's savings account contained barely $8,000. The ranch generated enough income to cover basic expenses, but legal battles were beyond his financial reach. Still, he nodded without hesitation. "Do whatever it takes. I'll find the money somehow." Driving home, Jack felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Even if he could raise the legal fees, even if they somehow defeated the eminent domain case, the authorities would still want Scout removed. The mountain lion's presence would always be seen as a liability, a ticking time bomb waiting to create tragedy. As they pulled into the ranch driveway, Scout immediately perked up, recognizing familiar territory. The big cat stretched and yawned, showing no awareness that his peaceful life was hanging by a thread. Duke wagged his tail, happy to be home, equally oblivious to the dangers surrounding them. Jack sat in his truck for a long moment, watching his animals and trying to memorize the scene. The ranch looked exactly as it had that morning, golden grassland stretching toward purple mountains. His modest house weathered but solid, the barn and outbuildings that had sheltered 3 generations of his family. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different now. Touched by the possibility of loss, that evening, Martha Henderson arrived with a casserole and an expression that told Jack she'd already heard about his visitor. News traveled fast in rural Montana, and Vincent Carrera's flashy sedan had probably been spotted and discussed at every coffee shop between the ranch and town. "Jack, honey, what's this I'm hearing about developers?" she asked without preamble, settling into her usual chair at his kitchen table, while Scout and Duke flanked her like devoted bodyguards. Jack told her everything, holding nothing back about the legal threats or Scout's precarious situation. Martha listened with the grim attention of someone who'd lived through enough hardships to recognize a serious crisis. Those sons of... She caught herself and glanced at Scout as if the mountain lion might be offended by profanity. "Those people have no right to take your home." "According to the law, they might," Jack said wearily. "And Scout makes everything worse legally, even though he's never been anything but gentle." Martha reached over and scratched Scout behind the ears, eliciting his deep purr. "This boy is more civilized than half the men I know. Anyone with eyes can see he's no threat." "Unfortunately, the law doesn't have eyes," Jack replied. "Just rules and regulations that don't account for love or loyalty or the fact that some bonds go deeper than species." As Martha prepared to leave, she squeezed Jack's shoulder with surprising strength. "Don't you dare give up on this family," she said fiercely. "Some fights are worth having, even if you're not sure you can win them." After she left, Jack sat on his porch with Scout and Duke, watching the stars emerge over their threatened paradise. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more phone calls to lawyers and wildlife officials, more impossible decisions. But tonight, they were still together, still a family, still home. Jack wrapped his arms around both animals and held on tight, storing up the moment against whatever darkness lay ahead. The phone call came at 6:30 the next morning, jerking Jack awake from restless dreams. Margaret Stone's voice was tight with urgency. "Jack, they've filed the wildlife seizure order. Sheriff's department will be there within the hour with animal control officers. You need to get Scout out of there immediately." Jack's feet hit the floor before his mind fully processed her words. "Where am I supposed to take him?" "I've been calling sanctuaries all night. There's one in Wyoming that might take him, but they need 48 hours to prepare proper housing. For now, you need to hide him somewhere until we can work out the legal details." "Hide him?" Jack looked out his bedroom window at Scout, who was stretched out in his favorite sunny spot by the barn, completely at peace. "He's a 150-pound mountain lion, not a house cat. I know it sounds impossible, but if they take him into custody now, we'll never get him back. They'll either ship him to an overcrowded facility or put him down as a safety precaution. You have maybe 30 minutes. Jack's mind raced through possibilities. The ranch offered plenty of hiding spots, but Scout wasn't wild anymore. He wouldn't understand why he needed to hide or stay away from his family. The mountain lion's trusting nature, which made him such a perfect companion, would work against him now. "There's an old mining cabin up in the hills," Jack said finally. "It's on my property, but hidden from the main roads. I could take him there. Do it now. And Jack, don't take Duke with you. If they see you leaving with both animals, they'll know you're hiding Scout somewhere." Hanging up, Jack threw on clothes and rushed outside. Duke immediately joined him, sensing the urgency, but Scout remained relaxed by the barn, enjoying the morning sun. Getting the mountain lion to follow him without Duke would be nearly impossible. The two animals were rarely separated. "Come on." "Scout," Jack called, patting his leg in the universal signal for "follow me." Scout lifted his head but didn't move. Clearly puzzled by the break-in routine, Jack grabbed a piece of raw meat from Scout's food storage and held it up. "Here, boy. Come on!" This time Scout rose and padded over, but when Jack started walking toward the hills, the mountain lion stopped and looked back at Duke expectantly. The two animals always traveled together. "Stay, Duke," Jack commanded, his voice firm despite the ache in his chest. Duke whined in confusion as Jack continued up the hillside with Scout, who kept looking back for his companion. The mining cabin sat in a grove of aspens, 2 miles from the main house, accessed by an old logging trail that was barely visible unless you knew where to look. Jack's grandfather had used it during hunting season, and it had sat empty for years since his death. The structure was weathered but sound, with a stone fireplace and enough space for a large animal to be comfortable. Scout explored the cabin with obvious confusion, sniffing every corner and repeatedly checking the door for Duke's familiar scent. When Jack tried to leave him there alone, Scout followed, clearly distressed by the separation from his family. "You have to stay here," Jack said, his voice breaking slightly. "Just for a while. I'll bring Duke to visit as soon as I can." He managed to coax Scout back inside with more meat, then quickly closed the door before the mountain lion could follow him again. Scout's confused vocalizations, a mixture of purr and whine that Jack had never heard before, cut through him like physical pain. Racing back down the hillside, Jack reached his house just as 3 vehicles turned into his driveway. 2 Sheriff's Department SUVs flanked a white van with Montana Wildlife Services painted on the side. Jack's heart sank as he recognized the lead officer, Deputy Tom Bradley, whose daughter had been in Jack's wife's kindergarten class years ago, mourning. "Jack," Bradley said, his tone apologetic but official, "I'm sorry about this, but we've got a court order to seize a mountain lion reported to be living on your property." "What mountain lion?" Jack asked, hoping his voice sounded steadier than it felt. Dr. Rebecca Hall from Wildlife Services stepped forward, her expression professionally neutral. "Mr. Rylan, we have a credible report of an adult male mountain lion being kept as a domestic animal without proper permits. Harboring wild predators poses serious public safety risks." "I don't have any wild animals here," Jack said calmly. "Just my dog Duke," Deputy Bradley gestured toward the house. "Mind if we take a look around?" The report was very specific, about a mountain lion named Scout. Jack's mind scrambled for options. "Go ahead and search. You won't find any mountain lions here." The officers spent 45 minutes combing through every building on the property. They found Scout's food storage, his oversized bed in Jack's bedroom, even his collection of toys and rope chewables. But they found no Scout. Dr. Hall examined the evidence with growing suspicion. "This is definitely mountain lion food," she said, pointing to the raw meat stores. "And these scratch marks on the fence posts are too high and too wide for a domestic dog." "Mountain lions pass through this area all the time," Jack replied. "I keep meat on hand in case I need to distract one from my cattle." "The scratches could be from any wild cat-marking territory. Where's this dog of yours?" Deputy Bradley asked, clearly not buying Jack's explanation. Duke appeared on cue, trotting around the corner of the barn with his tail wagging. The German shepherd greeted the officers politely, his normal, friendly demeanor intact, despite the obvious stress radiating from Jack. Dr. Hall knelt down to examine Duke more closely. "Has this dog been socialized with other large animals?" "He seems unusually calm around strangers." "He's a ranch dog," Jack said simply. "He's used to all kinds of situations." After another 30 minutes of searching, including a sweep of the immediate hillsides with binoculars, the officers finally gave up. Dr. Hall left her business card with a stern warning that harboring illegal wildlife would result in serious federal charges. "This isn't over," she told Jack. "We'll be back with better equipment and more personnel. If there's a mountain lion on this property, we will find it." As the vehicles disappeared down his driveway, Jack sank onto his porch steps with Duke pressed against his side. The dog whined softly, clearly distressed by Scout's absence. They'd never been separated for more than a few hours in 6 years. That afternoon, Jack made the treacherous hike back to the cabin with supplies for Scout and Duke in tow. He found the mountain lion pacing frantically near the door, his usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. When Duke appeared, Scout's relief was palpable. He rubbed against his companion with deep purrs, as if reassuring himself that his family was still intact. But Jack couldn't stay long. Dr. Hall had promised surveillance, and any sign of the animals together would confirm her suspicions. He left Duke with Scout for an hour, long enough for both animals to calm down, then made the heartbreaking decision to separate them again. "I'll figure this out," he promised Scout as he led Duke away. "We'll find a way to stay together." But as he walked back down the mountainside, with only Duke beside him, Jack wondered if he was making promises he couldn't keep. The cabin was only a temporary solution. Scout couldn't live in isolation indefinitely, separated from his family and everything he'd ever known as home. That evening, Margaret Stone called with an update that felt like another blow. The Wyoming Sanctuary had withdrawn their offer after learning about the legal complications surrounding Scout's case. 2 other facilities had refused even to consider taking him, citing liability concerns and their own regulatory challenges. "We're running out of options," Margaret admitted. "And I have to warn you, hiding Scout from authorities adds charges of obstruction and interfering with the federal investigation. If they catch you, the penalties could be severe." Jack sat in his empty house, listening to Duke whine at the door for his missing companion. Outside, the ranch felt incomplete without Scout's protective presence patrolling the boundaries. The developer had struck with surgical precision, using the law to dismantle Jack's family piece by piece. For the first time since the crisis began, Jack felt the weight of potential defeat settling over him like winter fog. Even if he somehow saved the ranch, could he save Scout? And what kind of victory would that be if it meant sacrificing the animal who had brought such unexpected joy and purpose to his life? The questions haunted him as night fell over the Montana hills, where Scout waited alone in an abandoned cabin, trusting that his human would somehow make everything right again. 3 days of living a lie had aged Jack 10 years. Every morning he made the grueling hike to the mining cabin with food and water for Scout, watching his beloved companion grow more listless and confused with each passing hour. The mountain lion's usual playful energy had been replaced by restless pacing and anxious vocalizations that echoed off the cabin walls like a cry for freedom. Duke was suffering too. The German shepherd had stopped eating properly, spending most of his time staring up the hillside toward Scout's hiding place. He would follow Jack partway up the trail during supply runs, whining plaintively when forced to turn back. The separation was breaking both animals' hearts, and Jack felt responsible for their misery. Dr. Hall and her team had returned twice, expanding their search radius each time. They'd brought thermal imaging equipment on the second visit, scanning the hills methodically while Jack watched from his porch, his stomach churning with anxiety. The cabin's stone construction and thick walls had hidden Scout's heat signature, but Jack knew their luck couldn't last forever. Margaret Stone's legal strategy was hitting roadblocks at every turn. The eminent domain case was proceeding on schedule despite her preliminary injunction, and the wildlife violation charges hung over Jack like a sword. Worse, word of Scout's situation had begun spreading through the local community, dividing longtime neighbors into camps of support and concern. The morning of the 4th day brought an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Ben Morrison had served the county for 23 years and had known Jack since high school. He pulled up to the ranch in his personal truck rather than his official vehicle, a detail that didn't escape Jack's notice. "Jack, we need to talk," Morrison said, settling into a porch chair without invitation. Duke approached cautiously, sensing the gravity of the conversation. "If this is about Scout, I already told your deputies. Cut the crap, Jack." Morrison's voice was tired, but not unkind. "Half the county knows you're hiding that cat somewhere on your property. Dr. Hall is talking about bringing in federal wildlife agents if she doesn't find evidence soon. This is getting bigger than either of us can handle." Jack remained silent, scratching Duke behind the ears while his mind raced through options. "I've known you for 40 years, Morrison continued. "You're not a criminal, and from what I hear, that mountain lion isn't a threat to anyone. But the law is the law, and I can't protect you much longer. What are you suggesting?" Morrison leaned forward, his expression earnest. There's a man I know, Dr. James Whitehorse. He runs a private wildlife research facility about 6 hours from here. It's not a zoo or a tourist attraction, just a place where animals who can't be returned to the wild can live in peace. He's helped me with problem bears and injured eagles over the years. Jack's chest tightened. You want me to give Scout away? I want you to give Scout a chance at a real life, Morrison replied gently. Hiding in that old mining cabin isn't living, it's just existing. And every day you keep him hidden makes the eventual consequences worse for both of you. The sheriff pulled out a business card and set it on the porch railing. Whitehorse has proper federal permits, acres of natural habitat, and experience with animals who've been human socialized. Scout could have companionship, space to roam, regular veterinary care. It's not the same as staying here, but it's a hell of a lot better than what happens if Wildlife Services catches you. After Morrison left, Jack sat on his porch, staring at the business card until the words blurred together. The rational part of his mind knew the sheriff was right. Scout deserved better than a life of hiding and fear. But the emotional part, the part that had bottle-fed an orphaned cub and watched him grow into a gentle giant, rebelled against the idea of separation. That afternoon, Jack climbed the hill to find Scout lying motionless in the cabin's doorway, his amber eyes dull with depression. The mountain lion barely acknowledged his human's arrival, showing none of his usual enthusiasm for food or attention. It was clear that isolation was destroying him as surely as any physical illness. "I'm so sorry, boy," Jack whispered, kneeling beside Scout and running his hands through the big cat's tawny fur. "I never wanted this for you." Scout's response was a weak purr that broke Jack's heart. This magnificent animal, who had once patrolled the ranch boundaries with confident pride, was withering away like a flower denied sunlight. That evening, Jack made the phone call he'd been dreading. Dr. James Whitehorse answered on the second ring, his voice warm and professional. "Sheriff Morrison told me about your situation," Whitehorse said after Jack explained. "I'd be happy to evaluate your mountain lion for placement here, but I need to be honest. The transition won't be easy for him or for you." "What would his life be like there?" Jack asked. "He'd have a large enclosed habitat with natural features, trees, rocks, a stream. There are other big cats here, though he'd be housed separately until we determine his social compatibility. He'd receive excellent medical care and as much human interaction as he's comfortable with. Could I visit him?" There was a pause. "Initially, I'd recommend against it. Animals who've been human-bonded need time to adjust to their new environment without the confusion of visits from their previous family. Eventually, once he's settled, we could arrange occasional supervised visits." Jack closed his eyes, feeling like a parent discussing custody arrangements. "How long is eventually?" "At least 6 months, possibly longer." "I know that's hard to hear, but it's what's best for the animal. Constant reminders of his previous life will prevent him from adapting to his new one." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering logistics, transportation, and legal documentation. Dr. Whitehorse agreed to drive up the following weekend to evaluate Scout and, if appropriate, transport him immediately to avoid further legal complications. After hanging up, Jack walked outside, where Duke was waiting by the porch steps, his intelligent eyes full of questions Jack couldn't answer. The dog had been Scout's constant companion for 6 years. How do you explain to him that his best friend won't be coming home? The next morning brought more bad news. Margaret Stone called to report that Vincent Carrera had filed additional complaints with the county health department, claiming that Jack's property posed public safety risks that required immediate intervention. An inspection was scheduled for the following week. "He's building a paper trail to strengthen the eminent domain case," Margaret explained. "Every violation he can document makes it easier to argue that your property should be seized for public benefit. And if they find Scout during the inspection, then we're looking at federal charges on top of everything else. Jack, you have to make a decision. Either surrender Scout voluntarily to a licensed facility, or risk having him seized and destroyed by authorities who won't care about his gentle nature or your bond with him." That afternoon, Jack climbed the hill one more time to sit with Scout in the abandoned cabin. The mountain lion seemed to sense his human's distress, pressing close and purring softly, despite his own obvious misery. They sat together in the fading light, man and cat united by a love that transcended species but couldn't overcome human law. "You saved me, you know," Jack whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. "After Sarah died, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone. But you and Duke became my family, gave me something to care about again." Scout rubbed his massive head against Jack's shoulder, the gesture achingly familiar and precious. "I have to let you go," Jack continued, the words feeling like broken glass in his throat. "Not because I want to, but because I love you too much to watch you waste away in hiding. You deserve better than this." As the stars began to appear over the Montana hills, Jack made his decision. He would call Dr. Whitehorse in the morning and arrange Scout's transportation. It would be the hardest thing he'd ever done, but sometimes love meant letting go, even when every fiber of your being wanted to hold on forever. The mountain lion seemed to understand, settling his head in Jack's lap with a deep sigh that spoke of resignation and trust. Whatever came next, Scout would face it with the same gentle courage he'd shown throughout his unlikely life as part of a rancher's family. Word traveled fast in small rural communities, and by Thursday morning, half the county seemed to know about Jack Ryland's impossible situation. The phone calls started before sunrise, some offering support, others expressing concern about a dangerous predator living among them. Jack let most calls go to voicemail, too emotionally drained to defend his choices repeatedly. Martha Henderson arrived at noon with a truck full of neighbors. Jack watched from his kitchen window as 8 people climbed out of various vehicles, their faces set with determination. He recognized most of them, the Kowalski family from the next ranch over. Pete Hernandez, who ran the local feed store, elderly Mrs. Chen, whose grandchildren had met Scout during visits to Martha's place. "We came to help," Martha announced without preamble, as the group gathered on Jack's porch. Duke greeted each visitor with his usual friendliness, his tail wagging, despite the absence of his companion. "There's nothing anyone can do," Jack said wearily. "The legal system has made its decision." "The hell it has," Pete Hernandez spoke up, his weathered face flushed with indignation. "Vincent Carrera's been all over town, spreading lies about your cat being some kind of killer. People who've never even been to your ranch are calling for Scout to be destroyed." Mrs. Chen, despite being barely 5 feet tall and 83 years old, stepped forward with surprising authority. "My grandson Kevin has played with Scout since he was 7 years old. That mountain lion is gentler than most house cats. Anyone who wants to hurt him will have to go through me first." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I appreciate the support, but hiding Scout isn't a long-term solution. Dr. Whitehorse from the wildlife facility is coming Saturday to transport him somewhere safe. What if there was another option?" Martha asked quietly. Before Jack could respond, she pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "We've been doing some research. Turns out Vincent Carrera's Development Corporation has a few skeletons in their closet." Pete opened the folder and spread several newspaper clippings across the porch table. "They built a resort in Colorado 3 years ago, promised jobs and economic development, just like here. But look what really happened." Jack examined the articles with growing interest. Headlines told a story of environmental damage, broken promises, and a community left struggling after the resort failed financially within 18 months. Local businesses had been driven out to make way for overpriced shops that never attracted enough customers. The promised jobs lasted only long enough to complete construction. "There's more," Martha continued, producing additional documents. "The company has a pattern of using eminent domain to acquire land cheaply, then abandoning projects when they become less profitable. They're not developers, they're land speculators." Young Tommy Kowalski, fresh out of college with a degree in environmental science, pointed to a technical report. Their Colorado resort also violated multiple environmental protection laws. They diverted water sources, destroyed wildlife habitats, and left contaminated construction sites. "The cleanup is still ongoing." Jack felt a spark of hope igniting in his chest. "How did you find all this?" "Kevin Chen might be 16, but he's a wizard with internet research," Mrs. Chen said proudly. "He found court records, EPA violations, bankruptcy filings, everything Carrera probably hoped would stay buried." Martha leaned forward intently. Jack, what if we could prove that Carrera's project isn't actually in the public interest? What if we could show that it would harm the community rather than help it? That might strengthen our legal challenge, Jack agreed, though he tried to keep his expectations realistic. But it doesn't solve Scout's situation. Even if we stop the development, wildlife authorities still want him removed. One battle at a time, Pete said firmly. First we deal with Carrera, then we figure out how to protect Scout legally. The group spent the afternoon planning their strategy. Tommy would compile a comprehensive environmental impact assessment showing how the resort would damage local water sources and wildlife habitats. Pete would organize testimony from business owners about the economic risks of depending on tourism development. Mrs. Chen would coordinate a petition drive to demonstrate community opposition. Martha had the most ambitious task. I'm calling a town meeting for tomorrow night. People need to hear the truth about what Carrera's really planning, and they need to understand what Scout actually is. A gentle animal who's been part of our community for years. Martha, that could backfire, Jack warned. Not everyone is going to see Scout the way we do. Some people will be genuinely afraid. Then we'll deal with their fears honestly, she replied. But we won't let Carrera spread lies without challenge. As the neighbors prepared to leave, each offered personal support that touched Jack deeply. The Kowalskis promised to provide character testimony about Scout's gentle nature. Pete offered to cover some of Jack's legal expenses through a community fund he was organizing. Mrs. Chen simply hugged him and said, "That mountain lion chose to love you, and you chose to love him back. That's not something we throw away without a fight." After they left, Jack climbed the hill to check on Scout with Duke at his side. The mountain lion's condition hadn't improved. If anything, he seemed more lethargic and depressed. When Duke appeared, Scout managed a weak tail flick, but didn't rise from his position by the cabin door. "Hold on just a little longer," Jack whispered, kneeling beside his ailing companion. Maybe there's still hope. But even as he spoke the words, Jack knew time was running out. Dr. Whitehorse would arrive in 2 days. And regardless of any legal victories, Scout couldn't continue living in isolation. The mountain lion needed either freedom or a new home, and freedom seemed impossible given the legal constraints. That evening, Margaret Stone called with mixed news. "I've reviewed the materials your neighbors collected about Carrera's company. It's excellent ammunition for challenging the eminent domain case. We might actually have grounds for proving the development isn't in legitimate public interest." "That's wonderful," Jack said, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. "But," Margaret prompted, clearly detecting his hesitation, "but Scout can't wait for legal victories that might take months or years. He's deteriorating physically and emotionally. If I don't do something soon, I'll lose him anyway, just to despair instead of authorities." "I understand. Have you made a decision about the wildlife facility?" Jack looked out his window toward the hills where Scout waited in lonely exile. "Dr. Whitehorse seems like a good man, and his facility sounds humane. Maybe it's the best option Scout has now. What about visits? I know he mentioned restrictions initially. 6 months minimum before I could see him, possibly longer." Jack's voice cracked slightly. "By then, he might not even remember me." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Jack, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before answering. If we could somehow resolve both the land case and Scout's legal status, if we could find a way for him to stay home legally, would you want to fight for that outcome, even if the odds were against us?" "Of course, but don't give me the but," Margaret interrupted. "Just answer the question. Would you fight?" Jack thought of Scout's amber eyes, now dulled with depression and confusion. He thought of Duke's lonely vigil by the porch steps. He thought of the ranch that had been his family's home for 3 generations, now threatened by a man who saw it only as a business opportunity. "Yes," he said firmly, "I'd fight. Good, because I have an idea that's either brilliant or completely insane. I'll call you in the morning." As Jack prepared for bed, he found himself caught between hope and resignation. His neighbor's support had been overwhelming and unexpected, proof that Scout had touched more lives than he'd realized. But legal battles were unpredictable, and wild animals couldn't wait for human justice to run its course. Outside, The Montana night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere up in those hills, Scout lay alone in an abandoned cabin, trusting that his human would find a way to make everything right. Jack fell asleep praying that trust wouldn't be misplaced. Margaret Stone's call came at 7 a.m. sharp, her voice charged with excitement that cut through Jack's morning fog like lightning. "Jack, you need to sit down for this. I've been up all night researching something, and what I found changes everything." Jack settled into his kitchen chair, Duke pressing close to his legs as if sensing important news. "What did you discover?" "Vincent Carrera doesn't actually have legal authority to seize your property. The eminent domain filing is fraudulent." Jack's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean, fraudulent?" "I mean, he's been lying to you from day one. Real eminent domain proceedings require extensive government oversight, environmental impact studies, public hearings, and approval from multiple state agencies. Carrera filed preliminary paperwork to make it look official, but he never completed the actual legal process." The kitchen seemed to tilt around Jack as the implications sank in. "So the legal notice he showed me is worthless. It's designed to scare property owners into selling voluntarily without forcing him to go through the expensive and time-consuming real eminent domain process. He's essentially running a sophisticated con game." Jack set down his coffee with shaking hands. "But what about the state approval he mentioned? The public benefit justification doesn't exist. I called the State Development Office this morning. They have no record of any resort project approval for your area. Carrera's company filed a preliminary inquiry 6 months ago, but it was rejected due to environmental concerns and insufficient economic justification." The revelation hit Jack like a physical blow. For days, he'd been torturing himself and Scout based on lies. "Margaret, are you absolutely certain about this?" "I have the state documents right here. Not only was his project rejected, but the Mountain Vista Development Corporation is currently under investigation by the State Attorney General for fraudulent land acquisition practices in 3 other counties." Jack stood abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see the hills hiding Scout. "This means Scout doesn't have to leave. The property isn't being seized. We're not criminals." "Well, technically you are still harboring an illegal wild animal," Margaret said with gentle humor. "But yes, the immediate crisis was manufactured. Carrera used Scout's presence as additional leverage, threatening to report you to authorities unless you cooperated with his fake legal demands." Anger began building in Jack's chest, hot and righteous. "That son of a, he's been terrorizing us for nothing. Scout's been suffering in that cabin because of a lie." "It gets worse," Margaret continued grimly. "I also discovered that Carrera's been spreading rumors around town about Scout being dangerous. He's the source of most of the opposition your neighbors have been fighting. He's been actively trying to turn the community against you to weaken any potential resistance to his plans." Jack's hands clenched into fists. The man hadn't just threatened his family. He'd tried to destroy Scout's reputation and divide the community that had come to accept and love the mountain lion. "What are our options?" Jack asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. "We file fraud charges immediately. We also pursue civil damages for emotional distress, property damage, and the costs you've incurred fighting his fake legal action. Plus, I'm pretty sure we can get restraining orders to keep him away from your property and prevent any further harassment." Jack felt a weight lifting from his shoulders for the first time in a week. "When can we move on this?" "Today. I'm driving up to your place within the hour with paperwork for criminal complaints and civil litigation. We'll file everything before noon and have sheriff's deputies serving Carrera with arrest warrants by evening." After Margaret hung up, Jack stood in his kitchen feeling like a man who'd just been told he wasn't dying after all. The relief was almost overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by concern for Scout. The mountain lion had been alone and confused for nearly a week, suffering needlessly because of one man's greed and deception. Jack was preparing for the hike up to the cabin when another call came in. This one from Dr. Whitehorse at the wildlife facility. "Mr. Rylan, I wanted to confirm our appointment for Saturday. I should arrive around noon to evaluate and transport your mountain lion. Actually, Dr. Whitehorse, there's been a development. The legal situation has changed, and Scout might not need to be relocated after all. There was a pause. I see. However, I should point out that state wildlife regulations haven't changed. Keeping a mountain lion without proper permits is still illegal, regardless of your property status. Jack's heart sank as reality reasserted itself. Even with Carrera's fraud exposed, Scout's situation remained legally precarious. What would it take to get proper permits? Honestly, it's almost impossible for private individuals. The permits are typically reserved for licensed wildlife facilities, educational institutions, or research organizations. The liability requirements alone would bankrupt most people. So even though Scout has lived peacefully here for 6 years, even though he's never hurt anyone, the law still considers him an illegal animal. I'm afraid so. The regulations don't distinguish between dangerous wild animals and well-socialized ones. From the government's perspective, he's a public safety risk regardless of his actual behavior. After ending the call, Jack sat heavily at his kitchen table, his brief euphoria replaced by a familiar sense of helplessness. Exposing Carrera's fraud would save the ranch, but Scout remained in legal limbo. The mountain lion still couldn't come home safely. The phone rang again. Sheriff Morrison this time. Jack, I just got off the phone with Margaret Stone. Sounds like you've been dealing with a real piece of work in this Carrera fellow. Ben, I need to ask you something directly. If Scout's presence here isn't connected to any property seizure, and if he's never posed a threat to anyone, would your department still pursue removing him? Morrison sighed heavily. Jack, you know I like you. And from everything I've seen, that cat of yours is about as dangerous as a golden retriever. But Dr. Hall from Wildlife Services is still breathing down our necks. She's convinced Scout represents a lawsuit waiting to happen. What if the community formally supported keeping him here? What if we could prove he's actually beneficial to local safety and wildlife management? You'd need something official. Maybe if he was classified as an educational animal or part of a research program, something that would give him legal protection under state regulations. An idea began forming in Jack's mind. Crazy but potentially workable. What about Dr. Patricia Morse? She's been Scout's veterinarian for years. Could she help establish some kind of official status for him? Maybe. Pat's got connections with the State Veterinary Board and wildlife management agencies. If anyone could figure out a legal pathway, it would be her. Jack spent the rest of the morning making phone calls and researching options. Dr. Morse was intrigued by his situation and agreed to investigate whether Scout could be designated as an educational animal under her veterinary supervision. Several university wildlife programs expressed interest in studying Scout's unique socialization, which might provide research justification for keeping him. By noon, when Margaret Stone arrived with legal documents exposing Carrera's fraud, Jack had the beginnings of a plan to secure Scout's future legally. But first, they had to deal with the man who had put them all through hell, based on lies and greed. Are you ready to take this fight to Carrera? Margaret asked, spreading arrest warrants and civil complaints across Jack's kitchen table. Jack looked up toward the hills, where Scout waited in exile, then at Duke, who had barely left his side all week. His unusual family had been torn apart by deception and threatened by someone who saw them only as obstacles to profit. I'm more than ready, Jack said grimly. It's time that man learned the difference between legal authority and criminal fraud. As they prepared to drive to town and file charges, Jack felt a grim satisfaction building in his chest. Vincent Carrera had picked the wrong rancher to intimidate, threatened the wrong family to destroy. Now he would face the consequences of his actions, both legal and personal. But even as they prepared their counterattack, Jack's mind remained focused on the mountain lion waiting alone in the hills. Exposing Carrera was only the first step. The real battle would be finding a way for Scout to come home legally and safely, to restore the family that had been fractured by lies and legal manipulation. Time was still running out, but now Jack had hope, and hope, combined with righteous anger, could be a powerful force for change. The Whitmore County Courthouse had never seen anything quite like the scene that unfolded Friday afternoon. Jack sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Margaret Stone and Sheriff Morrison, watching as Vincent Carrera was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. The developer's expensive suit looked wrinkled, and his confident demeanor had evaporated entirely. Behind Jack, the courtroom was packed with neighbors, friends, and community members who had rallied to his cause. Martha Henderson sat directly behind him, her hand resting supportively on his shoulder. The Kowalski family occupied an entire row, along with Pete Hernandez, Mrs. Chen, and dozens of others who had come to witness justice being served. Judge Patricia Walsh, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had presided over the county court for 20 years, reviewed the charges with obvious disapproval. Mr. Carrera, you stand accused of criminal fraud, forgery of government documents, intimidation of property owners, and conspiracy to commit theft by deception. How do you plead? Carrera's lawyer, a nervous-looking man who had clearly been hastily retained, whispered urgently in his client's ear before standing. Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges. We believe this is a misunderstanding that can be resolved through civil negotiations. Judge Walsh's expression suggested she found that argument less than compelling. Mr. Carrera, according to the evidence presented by the State Attorney General's office, your company has been operating a systematic fraud scheme across multiple counties. This court takes such allegations very seriously. Margaret Stone rose to address the court. Your Honor, Mr. Carrera's actions have caused severe emotional distress to my client and his family. He used fabricated legal documents to terrorize an elderly rancher into abandoning his family home of 70 years. The psychological damage alone warrants the maximum penalties allowed by law. As the legal proceedings continued, Jack found his mind drifting to Scout, still hidden in the mountain cabin. Even with Carrera's fraud exposed, the mountain lion's situation remained precarious. Dr. Morse had spent the morning making calls to state wildlife officials, seeking any possible pathway to legal status for Scout, but bureaucratic wheels turned slowly. The town meeting Martha had organized was scheduled for that evening, and Jack knew it would be crucial for Scout's future. Public support might influence regulatory decisions, but it could also backfire if opponents raised valid safety concerns. The delicate balance between protecting Scout and acknowledging legitimate public interests would determine whether his unusual family could ever be reunited. Court adjourned with Carrera remanded to custody, pending a bail hearing. As the developer was led away, he caught Jack's eye and hissed, "This isn't over. That animal of yours is still illegal, and I'll make sure everyone knows it." Margaret quickly stepped between them. "Mr. Carrera, I'd strongly advise against making threats while facing criminal charges. Such statements could be construed as continued intimidation." Outside the courthouse, Jack was surrounded by supporters offering congratulations and continued assistance. The sense of community support was overwhelming, but Jack remained focused on the challenges ahead. "The legal victory feels good," he told Martha as they walked to their vehicles, "but Scout is still in that cabin, still suffering, still technically illegal. Until that changes, nothing is really resolved." Martha squeezed his arm. "One step at a time, Jack. Tonight's meeting will show everyone who Scout really is. Once they understand, I believe this community will find a way to protect him." That afternoon, Jack made another supply run to Scout's hideout, this time bringing Duke along for a longer visit. The mountain lion's joy at seeing his companion was heartbreaking in its intensity. Scout rubbed against Duke with desperate affection, as if trying to convince himself that his family was still intact. "I know this is hard," Jack whispered, settling beside both animals in the afternoon sun outside the cabin. "But it might be over soon. People are fighting for you, Scout, more people than you could imagine." Scout pressed his massive head against Jack's chest, purring with the deep contentment that came from being reunited with his loved ones. For a brief moment the world felt right again. But as the sun began to set, Jack faced the heartbreaking necessity of separating them once more. The town meeting was held in the high school gymnasium, the only space large enough to accommodate the crowd that had gathered. Jack was amazed to see over 200 people in attendance, nearly a quarter of the county's population. News of Carrera's arrest had spread quickly, along with the story of Scout's situation. Martha had organized the evening like a formal hearing, with scheduled speakers representing different perspectives on Scout's future. Dr. Morse spoke first, presenting 6 years of veterinary records documenting Scout's excellent health and gentle temperament. In my professional opinion, Dr. Morse concluded, Scout represents no greater public safety risk than any large domestic dog. His behavior has been consistently gentle, predictable, and appropriate to his social environment. Tommy Kowalski presented his environmental research, showing how Scout's presence had actually benefited local wildlife management by deterring problem animals from residential areas. Mountain lions are natural territory regulators, he explained to the attentive crowd. Scout's presence has reduced conflicts with wild predators while posing no threat to livestock or humans. Mrs. Chen spoke about Scout's interactions with children over the years. My grandson Kevin has played with Scout since he was 7 years old. That mountain lion has been more patient and gentle with children than many family pets. He's never shown aggression, never acted unpredictably, never given anyone reason to fear him. But the meeting also included opposing voices. Dr. Rebecca Hall from Wildlife Services presented her concerns about legal precedents and public safety regulations. While I appreciate the emotional attachment this community has to this animal, she said carefully, we cannot ignore the legal framework that exists to protect public safety. Making exceptions for one well-behaved wild animal could set dangerous precedents for future cases. A heated debate followed, with community members arguing passionately on both sides. Some worried about liability issues if Scout ever injured someone. Others argued that 6 years of peaceful coexistence proved he belonged in the community. Finally, Jack rose to speak. The gymnasium fell silent as he walked to the makeshift podium. Duke at his side as always. 6 years ago, I found a dying cub tangled in barbed wire, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the large space. I could have left him there, called authorities, followed proper protocols. Instead, I chose to save a life. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some supportive, others skeptical, all listening intently. Scout didn't ask to be born wild. He didn't choose to lose his mother, to need human care to survive. But when given the choice between wildness and family, he chose family. Every day for 6 years, he's chosen love over instinct, gentleness over aggression, protection over predation. Jack's voice grew stronger as he continued. I know keeping Scout isn't conventional. I know it raises questions about safety and legality. But sometimes, conventional solutions aren't adequate for unconventional situations. Scout isn't just a mountain lion. He's a member of this community who has earned the right to be here through years of peaceful coexistence. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Jack raised his hand for quiet. However, I want to be clear about something. If this community doesn't feel safe with Scout here, if you believe his presence poses genuine risks to your families, I will make arrangements for him to be relocated to a licensed facility. His well-being and your peace of mind are both important to me. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with working groups forming to explore legal options and safety protocols. A citizens' committee was established to advocate for Scout with state wildlife agencies. Several lawyers volunteered to research precedents for community-based wildlife guardianship programs. As the meeting concluded, Jack felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in weeks. The community response had been overwhelmingly supportive, with creative solutions emerging from unexpected sources. But the ultimate decision still rested with government officials who might not be swayed by local sentiment. Dr. Morse approached him as the gymnasium emptied. Jack, I've been thinking about something all day. What if we could establish Scout as an educational ambassador animal under my veterinary supervision? It's a long shot, but there might be regulatory pathways we haven't explored. What would that involve? Formal behavioral assessments, enhanced insurance coverage, educational programming with local schools, regular inspections, basically treating Scout like a zoo animal that happens to live on a ranch instead of in a facility. Jack's heart leaped with hope. Do you think it could work? I think it's worth trying. I've already reached out to colleagues at the State Veterinary College. They're interested in studying Scouts' unique socialization as part of a research program. That could provide additional legal justification. As Jack drove home through the Montana darkness, he felt the weight of possibility settling over him like a warm blanket. The fraudulent threat to his land had been exposed and defeated. His community had rallied around Scout with unexpected passion and creativity. Legal pathways for keeping Scout home were emerging from the shadows, but challenges remained. Government bureaucracies moved slowly, and wildlife regulations weren't easily changed. Dr. Hall's concerns about legal precedents were valid, even if Jack disagreed with her conclusions. Time was still running out, with authorities potentially returning at any moment to seize Scout. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new negotiations, new hopes and fears. But tonight, for the first time in over a week, Jack fell asleep believing that his unusual family might actually have a future together on the ranch that had sheltered 3 generations of his ancestors. In the hills above, Scout waited in patient trust, unaware that his fate was being decided by people who had come to love him despite never expecting to share their world. With a mountain lion, the convoy of white, government vehicles arrived at Jack's ranch Saturday, morning like an unwelcome storm. 3 SUVs and a specialized transport truck marked with Montana Wildlife Services rolled up the dusty drive while Jack watched from his porch, his coffee growing cold in suddenly nerveless fingers. Dr. Rebecca Hall emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by 6 officers in tactical gear. Behind them came a familiar figure that made Jack's blood boil, Vincent Carrera, somehow out on bail and wearing a satisfied smirk that suggested he'd orchestrated this final assault on Jack's family. "Mr. Rylan," Dr. Hall called out as she approached the house, her voice professionally neutral but carrying an edge of finality. "We have federal warrants to search your property and seize the mountain lion you've been harboring illegally. I strongly advise you to cooperate fully." Jack stood slowly, Duke pressing against his legs in protective solidarity. "Dr. Hall, I assume you're aware that Mr. Carrera here was arrested yesterday for fraud. His entire legal claim against my property was fabricated. Your property dispute is irrelevant to wildlife violations," she replied curtly. "The animal remains illegal regardless of your land ownership status." Carrera stepped forward, his expensive suit replaced by casual clothes, but his arrogant demeanor unchanged. "I told you this would happen, Rylan. That animal is a ticking time bomb. And I made sure the right people finally understand the danger you're putting everyone in." "You mean the lies you've been spreading around town?" Jack's voice was dangerously quiet. "I mean the truth about keeping a killer predator as a pet," Carrera shot back. "When that thing finally snaps and mauls someone, their blood will be on your hands." Dr. Hall raised her hand to stop the confrontation before it escalated. "Gentlemen, we're here to resolve a wildlife violation, not to debate personal grievances. Mr. Rylan, where is the mountain lion?" Jack had known this moment would come, had prepared for it during the long week of hiding Scout in the hills. But facing it felt like standing before a firing squad composed of bureaucracy and legal authority. "I need to make some phone calls first," Jack said, pulling out his cell phone. "My lawyer, my veterinarian, people who need to be present for this." "You have 10 minutes, Dr. Hall replied. "Then we begin our search with or without your cooperation." Jack's first call went to Margaret Stone, who was already en route to the ranch with emergency legal injunctions. His second went to Dr. Morse, who confirmed she was 15 minutes away with documentation for Scout's potential educational animal status. His third call went to Martha Henderson. "They're here," he said simply when she answered. "We'll be there in 5 minutes," Martha replied without hesitation. Half the county is already on their way. While Jack made his calls, the wildlife officers spread out across the property with thermal imaging equipment and tranquilizer rifles. They moved with military precision, clearly expecting to encounter a dangerous wild animal rather than Scout's gentle nature. Carrera followed the search teams like a shadow, pointing out potential hiding spots with obvious satisfaction. "Check the old outbuildings," he suggested loudly. These rural types always have hiding places for illegal activities. Jack watched the man who had terrorized his family for weeks, now orchestrating what he hoped would be the final destruction of everything Jack held dear. The developer's vindictive pleasure was obvious, even facing fraud charges. He was determined to complete his revenge against the rancher who had dared to resist him. "You know," Jack said quietly as Carrera passed near the porch, "when this is over, when Scout is safe and your legal troubles catch up with you, I want you to remember something." Carrera paused, his expression mocking. "What's that, old man?" "I want you to remember that you tried to destroy a family. Not a business deal or a property acquisition, but a real family built on love and trust. And I want you to ask yourself what that makes you as a human being." For just a moment, something flickered across Carrera's face. Uncertainty, perhaps even shame. But it was quickly replaced by familiar arrogance. "Save your philosophical lectures," Carrera sneered. "That overgrown cat is going to be in a cage by noon, and there's nothing you or your backwoods neighbors can do about it." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Jack smiled grimly as he watched a parade of pickup trucks, SUVs, and even a few horse-trailers turning into his drive. Martha Henderson led the convoy, followed by what looked like half the population of the county. Dr. Hall's expression shifted from professional confidence to obvious concern as she watched dozens of community members spreading out across Jack's property. These weren't protesters or troublemakers. They were ranchers, shopkeepers, teachers, and families who had come to bear witness to Scout's fate. "This is still a federal wildlife operation," Dr. Hall announced loudly. "Civilian interference will result in arrest and prosecution." Martha Henderson walked directly up to her, followed by Mrs. Chen, the Kowalski family, and Pete Hernandez. Their faces were set with quiet determination. "We're not here to interfere," Martha said calmly. "We're here to ensure that justice is done fairly and that Scout's rights and Jack's rights are respected throughout this process." "Animals don't have rights under federal law," Dr. Hall replied. But her voice lacked its earlier authority. "No," Mrs. Chen spoke up, her elderly voice carrying surprising strength. "But community members do. We have the right to witness government actions that affect our neighbors and our safety. And we have the right to ensure that those actions are based on truth rather than the lies of a criminal." She pointed directly at Carrera, whose confident demeanor was beginning to crack under the weight of community disapproval. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Montana hills, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Scout's fate, but the future of Jack's unusual family and the community that had chosen to protect them. The thermal imaging equipment detected Scout's heat signature within 20 minutes. Jack's heart sank as he watched the tactical team converge on the hillside trail leading to his grandfather's old mining cabin. Dr. Hall coordinated the operation with military efficiency, her officers advancing with tranquilizer weapons ready. "There's no need for weapons," Jack called out desperately. "Scout won't resist. He doesn't even understand what's happening." "Standard protocol for dangerous wildlife," Dr. Hall replied without turning around. "We can't take chances with public safety." Jack started to follow the team up the hillside, but was stopped by a firm hand on his shoulder. Sheriff Morrison had arrived just in time to witness the operation's climax. "Let me go with them, Ben," Jack pleaded. "Scout needs to see a familiar face. He's been isolated for a week. He's already stressed and confused." Morrison studied Jack's face for a long moment, then nodded to Dr. Hall. "My officer will accompany your team to ensure proper procedures are followed and to minimize trauma to all parties involved." As they climbed the steep trail, Jack could hear Scout's vocalizations echoing down from the cabin, a mixture of confusion and distress that cut through him like broken glass. The mountain lion knew something was wrong, but couldn't understand what or why. The cabin came into view, and Jack saw Scout pacing anxiously in the small clearing outside. The magnificent animal looked thinner than when Jack had last visited, his golden coat dulled by stress and confinement. When Scout spotted Jack among the approaching officers, his amber eyes lit up with desperate hope. "Easy, boy," Jack called softly. It's going to be okay. Scout bounded toward Jack, but stopped short when he saw the strangers with their strange equipment. The mountain lion's body language shifted from joy to wariness, his natural instincts finally overriding his domesticated trust. Dr. Hall raised her tranquilizer rifle, but before she could fire, a new voice cut through the tension. "Dr. Hall, I need you to stop right there." Everyone turned to see Margaret Stone emerging from the woods, followed by Dr. Morse and a man Jack didn't recognize, an elderly Native American wearing a ranger's uniform. "This is Dr. James Whitehorse," Margaret announced breathlessly. "He's the director of the Blackfoot Nation Wildlife Preservation Program, and he has federal authority that supersedes your operation." Dr. Whitehorse stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate respect from both the wildlife officers and Scout, who seemed to sense something different about this new arrival. "Dr. Hall," Whitehorse said calmly, "I've reviewed the documentation for this animal, and I'm invoking federal tribal authority to transfer custody of the mountain lion to our educational ambassador program." "On what grounds?" Dr. Hall demanded, though she lowered her weapon. "On the grounds that Scout represents a unique opportunity for wildlife education and cultural preservation. The Blackfoot Nation has federal permits for educational animals, and this mountain lion's socialization makes him invaluable for teaching programs about coexistence between humans and wild animals." Jack felt his knees weaken with relief. But Dr. Whitehorse wasn't finished. "However," he continued, looking directly at Jack, "the animal cannot remain on unregulated private property. He would need to be housed at our facility, where proper safety protocols and educational programs can be maintained. But he could have visitors." Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Regular supervised visits with his human family would be part of his care plan," Dr. Whitehorse confirmed. "Our program recognizes that bonds between species, when properly managed, can be beneficial for both animal welfare and human education." Scout, as if sensing that his fate was being decided, approached the group slowly. His amber eyes moved from Jack to Dr. Whitehorse, and something passed between the mountain lion and the elderly ranger, a recognition that transcended species barriers. Dr. Hall holstered her tranquilizer rifle with obvious reluctance. "This is highly irregular." The animal was reported as dangerous by a concerned citizen. Vincent Carrera, who had remained silent during the confrontation, finally spoke up. "That cat is a menace waiting to happen. You can't just ignore public safety because of some sentimental attachment." Dr. Whitehorse turned to face Carrera with eyes that had seen decades of human folly and natural wisdom. "Mr. Carrera, I understand you're facing criminal charges for fraud and intimidation. Perhaps your concerns about public safety would carry more weight if they weren't motivated by personal revenge." The developer's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as community members who had witnessed his arrest began murmuring among themselves. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward decisively. "Dr. Hall, it seems like the custody issue has been resolved through proper federal channels. Unless you have specific evidence that this animal poses an immediate threat beyond the word of a man currently under indictment for fraud, I suggest we let Dr. Whitehorse's program take responsibility." Scout chose that moment to do something that perfectly captured his unique nature. He walked calmly over to little Kevin Chen, who had come with his grandmother to witness the confrontation, and sat down beside the boy exactly like a well-trained dog would do. The mountain lion's gentle presence beside the child spoke louder than any arguments about his character. Dr. Hall looked around at the assembled community members, at Scout's calm demeanor, at the federal permits Dr. Whitehorse carried, and finally at Jack's face, where 6 years of love and devotion were written in every line. "Fine," she said finally, "but this animal leaves this property today, and any future incidents will result in immediate termination orders." As the crowd began to disperse and the wildlife officers packed their equipment, Jack knelt beside Scout one last time. The mountain lion pressed his massive head against Jack's chest, purring with the deep contentment that came from being reunited with his human. "You're going to have a good life," Jack whispered into Scout's fur. "And I'll visit you every week. We'll still be family, just differently, Dr. Whitehorse approached gently. Mr. Rylan, Scout will have a large habitat with natural features, other animals for companionship if he wants it, and regular interaction with educational groups. It's not the same as living here, but it's a life of dignity and purpose, Jack nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. As the transport vehicle was prepared for Scout's journey to his new home, the mountain lion seemed to understand that another chapter of his remarkable life was beginning. He submitted to the travel crate with the same trust he'd shown throughout his years with Jack, confident that his human would ensure his safety and happiness. The last thing Jack saw as the convoy pulled away was Scout's amber eyes watching him through the crate window, patient and trusting as always. 6 months later, Jack Ryland stood in front of the large enclosure at the Blackfoot Nation Wildlife Preservation Program, watching Scout demonstrate his remarkable gentleness to a group of fascinated school children. The mountain lion had adapted to his new life with the same grace he'd brought to everything else, becoming the program's most beloved educational ambassador. He remembers you, Dr. Whitehorse observed, joining Jack at the viewing area. Watch how his whole demeanor changes when you arrive. It was true. Scout had been calmly interacting with the children and their teacher, but when he spotted Jack, his amber eyes lit up with unmistakable joy. The big cat padded over to the fence where Jack stood, pressing against the barrier and purring loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, boy," Jack murmured, reaching through the approved contact opening to scratch behind Scout's ears. "Looks like you're quite the teacher these days." Scout's purr deepened as he rubbed his massive head against Jack's hand. Even through the fence, their bond was evident to everyone watching. The children gathered closer, amazed to see such affection between human and wild animal. "How does he know you're not afraid?" asked a little girl with bright, curious eyes. Jack smiled at the question. "Because love recognizes love, sweetheart. Scout and I have been family for 7 years now. That doesn't change just because we live in different places." The educational program had exceeded everyone's expectations. Scout's unique socialization allowed him to interact safely with visitors while teaching invaluable lessons about wildlife conservation and the complex relationships between humans and nature. Universities were studying his behavioral patterns, and wildlife management policies were being revised based on insights gained from his case. Duke had adapted to their new routine as well, though the German shepherd still searched hopefully around the ranch whenever they returned from visits. The separation had been hardest on him, but regular reunions with Scout helped maintain their brotherhood across the miles. "The legal precedent your case established has been remarkable," Dr. Whitehorse continued as they watched Scout return to his interaction with the visiting students. 3 other communities have successfully negotiated alternative arrangements for human-bonded wildlife, using your story as a template. Jack felt a surge of pride mixed with bittersweet satisfaction. Scout's sacrifice, for it had been a sacrifice, leaving the only home he'd ever known, was helping other animals and families avoid the trauma they'd endured. The aftermath of Vincent Carrera's arrest had been swift and decisive. The developer was serving 2 years in federal prison for fraud, and his company had been dissolved by court order. The attempted land grab had backfired spectacularly, with environmental protections being strengthened for the entire area. Jack's ranch was now part of a conservation easement that would protect it from future development in perpetuity. Martha Henderson had become the unofficial coordinator of Scout's support network, organizing regular visits and fundraising for the wildlife program. The community's response had been overwhelming. Dozens of families now made monthly trips to see Scout, and local schools had incorporated his story into their environmental education curriculum. "How's he really doing?" Jack asked Dr. Whitehorse, as they watched Scout gently nose a wheelchair-bound boy who had been hesitant to approach. "Honestly, he's thriving in ways I didn't expect. The regular human interaction fulfills his social needs, and the educational mission seems to give him purpose. He's become protective of all the children who visit, especially the ones who are afraid or have disabilities." Dr. Morse emerged from the program's veterinary clinic, carrying Scout's latest health assessment. "Perfect bill of health," she announced with satisfaction. Weight stable, coat glossy, behavior indicators all positive. He's actually healthier now than he was during those stressful weeks of hiding. As the school group prepared to leave, Scout performed his signature farewell, sitting like a giant dog and lifting one paw in what looked remarkably like a wave. The children giggled and waved back, their earlier nervousness completely forgotten. "We should head back soon," Jack said reluctantly. The 3-hour drive to the ranch meant leaving before dark, and evening chores waited at home. But first, he had his weekly private time with Scout. Dr. Whitehorse unlocked a special visiting area where Jack could spend an hour alone with the mountain lion, maintaining their bond without the distractions of educational programming. Scout's joy at these private visits was profound. He would roll on his back like a giant house cat, play tug-of-war with his favorite rope toy, and curl up beside Jack for the kind of quiet companionship they'd shared for so many years on the ranch. "I know this isn't what either of us planned," Jack said softly, running his hands through Scout's thick fur. "But you're helping so many people understand that family comes in all forms, that love doesn't recognize species barriers." Scout's purr was his only response, but it conveyed everything that needed to be said between them. As Jack prepared to leave, he reflected on how much their lives had changed since that terrifying morning when government vehicles had arrived at his ranch. The fight to save Scout had revealed the strength of community bonds and the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. The drive home through the Montana wilderness gave Jack time to process the visit. Duke rode beside him, content after his reunion with Scout, but always a little sad to leave. The landscape rolled past unchanged, golden grasslands stretching toward purple mountains, the same vista that had welcomed him home for 57 years. Back at the ranch, Jack sat on his porch with Duke pressed against his legs, watching the sun set over their land. The property felt different now, protected by legal safeguards, but also marked by the memory of Scout's presence. The worn leather collar still hung on a hook by the kitchen door, waiting for the day Scout might come home for a visit. Martha Henderson's truck turned into the driveway right on schedule, bringing dinner and companionship as she had every week since Scout's departure. The widow understood loneliness and the healing power of found family, whether that family included humans, dogs, or mountain lions. "How was he today?" she asked, settling into her usual chair. "Happy," Jack replied honestly. "Different but happy. He's found a purpose that fulfills him, even if it's not the life we planned." As the stars emerged over Montana, Jack reflected on the year that had changed everything. He'd learned that family wasn't defined by law or convention, that love could bridge any gap, and that sometimes letting go was the ultimate act of devotion. Scout was safe, thriving, and teaching the world about the extraordinary bonds possible between humans and animals. Duke was healthy and cherished, his loyalty rewarded with the security of knowing he'd never face abandonment. The ranch was protected forever, a sanctuary where unconventional love had bloomed and been defended by an entire community. It wasn't the ending Jack had originally hoped for, but it was an ending filled with dignity, purpose, and the promise of continued connection. Some families, he'd learned, were strong enough to survive any distance, any challenge, any change, as long as love remained at their center. The Montana night settled around them, peaceful and eternal, sheltering a rancher, his dog, and the memory of a mountain lion who had taught them all what it meant to choose love over fear.